Hi everyone, this is Rob Corradini and thank you for joining my session this month for MVP Days. And my session this month is on simplifying the switch from VMware to Hyper-V. So let's get started. A little bit about Five9 before we get into it. Five9, we provide management, security, and migration solutions for Hyper-V in Azure. We have a platform that basically gives you the scalability and efficiency and performance that really empowers customer to really manage their assets around Hyper-V in Azure. Traditionally, you use tools like SCVMM and SCOM and etc., where we have a very unified interface. Currently, we have 1,000 plus customers in over 100 plus countries. We have over 100,000 virtualization admins using our product, and over 5 million virtual machines managed and protected by our product. Our unified platform really is around ease of automation and network architecture that really increases performance, simplifies management, and protects against cyber attacks. When we talk about this pillar of migrate, we have VMware ESX, Hyper-V, Microsoft Azure, AWS. We have the ability to do these migration services, and then we have this management part of it where we can give within our solutions RBAC controls and workload governance, self-provisioning templates, scheduled backup and recovery, automated lifecycle. And then you have the monitoring and secure portion of it where you can deal with real-time alerts and then also real-time policy configuration, all within one unified product. A little bit about me. My name is Robert Corradini again. I am a two-time Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center. I'm also the Director of Product Management here in Five9, and my job is really to spend time really understanding what the market looks like in the use cases and to really bring things that matter to customers to market. So what the agenda today is, first of all, we're going to get into some Hyper-V best practices, requirements around that, planning, migration, cleanup. Next, we'll get into Hyper-V deployment and around hyper availability, networking, live migration, templates, libraries. And then we'll get into Hyper-V management using the traditional tools around production, consumption, monitoring, and maintenance. And then again, as I mentioned, we'll get into talking about some of the traditional tools and then our tool. So let's get into Hyper-V best practices and really how we can reduce the complexity with careful planning and right tools. So just to kind of give you a little idea of what the landscape looks like, there is equivalence from the VMware side to the Hyper-V side. They just have a different name and even naming terminology when you're talking about certain things. For example, just as a very generic one, in VMware world, when you're moving a virtual machine from one host to another is a vMotion, and in Microsoft land, it's actually a live migration. Just a couple different naming terminologies, and it's the same thing with the products. Starting at the hypervised level, you have Hyper-V, and then obviously the ESX equivalent is vSphere or ESX, and then management is done with virtual SCVMM with Microsoft's traditional software, which is Virtual Machine Manager, and then the equivalent is vCenter on the other side. And then if you look on self-service, App Controller is on the Microsoft side, and then we have vCloud Director on the VMware side. And then on monitoring, we have SCOM, or System Center Operations Manager, and then on the vSphere side, we have Operations Management Suite. And it goes up from there, as you can see. I don't want to have to rename them all. You can understand there's all these equivalences from the VMware side to the Microsoft side. So when you're planning that migration from VMware or making that switch, you do have equivalence. And this comes down to right planning. So what are the requirements on Hyper-V? Really, it's a couple things. You have minimum requirements, and then you do also have recommended requirements. Obviously, you want to do the amount of requirements so you can deal with whatever the workload, the VM workload that's going to be running on that particular space. Or even if whatever the requirements of that particular virtualization software, if you're in this case SCVMM, those requirements are. You always want to exceed requirements and also maintain a buffer. 20% is always recommended because you always have overhead of OS and other related activities. Also, you want to make sure that that you can see all the sides of your Hyper-V hosts on the same subnet. You want to also ensure that virtualization is turned on within the system BIOS on those Hyper-V hosts. By default, a lot of hardware is not turned on. If you're managing more than 150 hosts, you definitely want to have a little bit more beefier requirements. And again, those requirements kind of move up, especially with the amount of hosts and we'll say aggregated data and management you're doing. So you also want to check all your VM requirements, CPU, RAM, hard disk. Again, it's recommended to maintain a 20% buffer. And you also want to ensure both sides are on the same subnet, and you also want to ensure virtualization is turned on within all your environment. First is you want to build out that hypervisor with an ISO. And next on the requirements is you want to determine if you're going to use a GUI or a non-GUI UI, like server with a UI or server core or nano, etc. So you want to evaluate your expertise, resources, and complexity for script-based conversions. And really determining that is if you want to using a GUI really gives you that speed and simplicity. Just you don't have to deal with scripting, etc. You also want to have a management VM, either like a SCOM SCVMM instance, and then you'd also need a SQL instance for storing all that data related to managing that VM. And that's traditional with any tool that manages a virtualization infrastructure. Monitoring tool. So typically when you're using monitoring of a Hyper-V infrastructure, you're using SCOM or System Center Operations Manager. It allows you to track health and application health on top, and also does up and down monitoring of loads and data stores, etc. So planning. What are the important questions to really ask when you're planning out this switch from ESX to Hyper-V? Will I be using existing hardware, or will I be going to new hardware? Which is very important because you want to make sure that everything that when you go to Hyper-V, that all the driver support is supported. How many VMs am I migrating? And this is also an opportunity to do a cleanup or a clean house cleaning on the environment. Do I know which VMs are a part of which workloads? Again, this is a real opportunity. This is where VM sprawl tends to be an issue, and when you have an environment that's been around for such a long time, and this is where you get into understanding and really documenting your workloads so you can get ready to do this switch. How much downtime will my migration require? And those are very important, especially for mission critical apps. If you want to plan all that around, you don't want to have you want to basically set expectations on what that downtime will be and how much it will require. What will have the least impact on production? Again, a very important question to be answered. And then there's pre-migration cleanup. Are we gonna? And these are all the typical things when you're doing and you're cleaning up these VMs and prepping them from ready to roll over for a migration to another hypervisor. You remove all attached CDs or floppy drives. Remove all VMs from unneeded hardware. If you have any unneeded NICs or anything of that nature, clean up all the disks. If you have 13 disks on there and it's only need one, remove them all. Commit all your snapshots, very important. So we have all that stuff committed. So that's all the stuff you do within pre-migration plan and cleanup and planning. So let's talk about migration and option one. With option one, you can use the built-in SCVMM tools, which is System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Things with SCVMM, it's very limited, especially if you have complex workloads. Very, very error-prone. It's really meant for ideal VMs and ideal workloads. We'll say something that kind of fits in a box. If you have something that has any kind of complexity to it, it's not a great tool to be using for migration of VMs from an ESX environment to Hyper-V. Now, option two is using a tool like us. We have a tool called 5.9 V2V converter. It has very low requirements. We support Server 2008 and above. Very low margin for error. It's all wizard based. Click and roll. Pick your resources where the sources, the destinations, and you're off and running. And again, you can do things like excluding things that may not be compatible, so you can get it up and running, and then you can do your reconciliation once it's been moved over from the source VM. On cleanup, you want to do a clean migration source within VMware. Again, I've mentioned this before. You want to remove anything that was not removed via API or anything other method. You also want to ensure other VMs that were copied are disabled, shut down, or killed. Again, you don't want to have this portion where you have a VM that can potentially turn on by accident and then obviously cause a conflict with what a VM that's already been migrated. So again, you want to make sure all that stuff are either disabled, shut down, or even just killed or archived off. You also want to perform an analysis on your new VMs that you've migrated over within the Hyper-V and SCOM environment. Review all the overall process resources, memory resources, and storage resources. Are you oversubscribing or undersubscribing? You really need to review each application that are on these workloads, on these VMs. And using SCOM with a management pack to trend out each virtualization workload. Management packs tend to be specific to types of applications, so you can monitor them more down to the synthetic level, like an Exchange management pack, or for example, a management pack for Citrix that allows you to look at VDI sessions. And then you also want to look into SCVMM tuning. And then you want to test your instances. Make sure everything has, if you shut them down, you're backing them up. If you're, all this type of things, you want to make sure that they're properly working before you bring them into production. So Hyper-V deployment. Let's get into this a little bit. High availability. This is very important in this day and age. If you're going to deploy, unless you're in a DevOps or a dev test environment, it's always a great idea to have high availability in your cluster. Failures and hardware failures and stuff of that nature are just a given in our industry, and building in high availability is always very important. When you're installing failover clusters, you are required to use 3 or more hosts. 4 are recommended, so you can essentially get full parity. You also may require device controllers or adapters like SAS controllers, fiber channel over Ethernet, iSCSI, depending on the storage technology you're using. You also want to build out that clustered instance on Hyper-V. So as simple as it's going into each VM and right-clicking and making highly available. So what that's really great is that inherently, once you've built out your Hyper-V instance and you've already had VMs there, it's not a big deal to essentially make a machine highly available once the cluster is built. Also, those are where you can set those settings to automatically restart if a host has a failure, etc. For high availability, there are tools. For option 1 is using Failover Cluster Manager. It is a little complex to use. It's not, I would say, intuitive. It also is disaggregated, and what I mean by that is it's not a tool that's built into SCVMM. It's a tool outside of SCVMM like Hyper-V Manager or SCOM. So you tend to have to kind of go back and forth between the tool sets. And then it's, I would say, generally unstable. And the reason I say that is that when you're having particular cluster issues, and it is an MMC tool, by the way, at the moment, when you're having cluster related issues, the tool is not so responsive and not so giving you the proper error identification you would be looking for. Option 2 is using Windows PowerShell. Now, this is always, for a person like me, this would be my option if you do definitely live and breathe inside of PowerShell, but it does require some really deep scripting knowledge. So definitely an option, but it's something in this day and age, if you want, to have a lot of agility, you're better off using something that makes it a lot more intuitive for you. And then option 3 is using a tool like us, Five9 Manager, where we have a simple UI. We actually build in Hyper-V management, functions as SCVMM, functions of SCOM, functions of Failover Cluster Manager, all within one tool. So in high availability, Hyper-V networking consists of 2 parts. So you have the virtual switch, which makes up of an external, it can be a couple different types, which is an external switch, which essentially is a pass-through. You have an internal switch, which essentially is within that subnet. And then you have a private switch, which can be privatized, where no one can access that network, with only people within that private switch could be accessing it. High availability, and now talk about networking. So Hyper-V networking consists of 2 parts. You have virtual switches and then virtual network adapters. And then under that, you have these external switches, internal switches, and private switches. And they have different levels of, say, permission levels or where you can access and go. On virtual network adapters, you have Hyper-V specific network adapters, or either Gen 1 or Gen 2. And then you also have what they consider legacy network adapters, which are Gen 1 only. The big thing with high availability is you want to match all networking on both sides, such as like the production network, VoIP phones, management. So when you're building out these networks, you want to make sure that when you migrate these over, essentially it migrates right into those VLANs or other virtual networks. And you want to make sure all VMs are in the proper network. So, this is where you look and document your source stuff. And when you're looking at your destination where this is, you want to make sure they're all in the proper network or VLAN. You want to make sure they can successfully communicate, route, or not route between networks, because we want to make sure everything upstream for them VM going out to maybe public facing internet is not blocking it or coming in. Very, very important to do all that type of testing before you bring that application back online. Live migration. You need to build a live migration network, and this is where you can deal with migrations of your virtual machines. You want to test out live migrations. You want to move workloads on the fly. You want to be able, for example, for like patching or upgrade cycles. You want to have zero downtime while upgrades are in progress. And then finally, you have live migration. You want to build that live migration network. You want to test live migration with Hyper-V, and you want to be able to move workloads on the fly. For example, like patch or upgrade cycles, and you want to have zero downtime while upgrades are in progress. Templates and libraries, and this is more about VM lifecycle. It's important questions to consider around application lifecycle versus VM lifecycle. Is that, do you have any drag in your current environment? Is there anything worth rebuilding instead of migrating? Because there are times that I would say in an Exchange world, for example, if you had an Exchange environment on ESX and you were going to Hyper-V for your Exchange environment, a better function would be to rebuild that Exchange function, in my opinion, and then do essentially connect the environment so we can replicate the DAGs over the database availability groups, and even the CAS servers are not worth rebuilding unless and because there's only really log files there, so you can just rebuild them on the other side. So there, again, that's an example of something that would be easier to rebuild instead of migrate. The average life cycle for a VM is almost about a year, just to kind of give you an FYI. And the reason this is for around best practices is that around a year, or I'd say 6 to 8 months, is where OS drag kicks in, and you have all these unnecessary updates or even unnecessary applications on there that have been installing by admins over time. This is especially prevalent in a UI environment where admins are jumping on machines and pulling things down as needed for whatever the situation arises. A little bit more on templates and libraries, to really reduce the work associated with manual rebuilding of VMs every year. Use templates, and it's really important, and also to keep these templates always up to date. And also creating templates is, converting VMs into templates for later use, because, those VMs can be patched for yourself, and then you're having those into templates. You can attach files like VHD, VHDX, or ISOs to templates. You can clone and reuse VMs for templates. In libraries, you can store all those templates. So moving on to Hyper-V management and best practices. Production, consumption, and monitoring. So what are the considerations to think about when you're running a Hyper-V environment? The one thing is that you have, when you're running it as a standalone, admins and using SCVMM, you deal with light permissions. But when you start going into tenant-based and you want to do self-service or allow admins, a certain amount of CPU, memory, and storage, and then they basically take that and carve it up as they will. The problem with that is that you're dealing with disparate tools, and you're dealing with Hyper-V Manager, SCVMM, SCOM, and it's a lot of headache to deal with a little bit of those tools. So where we come in there is Five9 Manager Data Center is that we essentially give you that mission control for your Microsoft Cloud. And we give you all those tools in a unified platform, and that's what sets us apart. We have built in all those tools and all those great things of SCVMM, SCOM, built in, and even Data Protection Manager in one tool. So we have unified cloud management, built-in backup discovery, deployment and configuration, like I mentioned, with like failover cluster manager functions, replication between sites. We have advanced virtualization security, and then the TCO compared to System Center is this much lower. So up for the demo. Managing and monitoring in Hyper-V can be difficult, as you can see here with Hyper-V Manager and also Failover Cluster Manager. They are very disaggregated tools, and these are the tools that come with Windows. Even with Microsoft tools of their enterprise-grade products, like SCVMM and SCOM, it's still disaggregated management. With Five9, you get management, monitoring, and backup and recovery all in one application and single pane of view. Hyper-V management doesn't have to be difficult with Five9 Manager Data Center. It's easy with a single application. I want to thank everybody today for joining my session on simplifying the switch from VMware to Hyper-V and how Five9 can help you. And to finalize this webinar, I was going to tell you a little bit about Five9 and what I do. As I said, I'm the Director of Product Management at Five9. We basically manage and protect your Microsoft Cloud all in one management plane. We were founded in 2009. We're headquartered in West Palm Beach with a staff in 26 regions worldwide, including 18 MVPs. We have over 100,000 Hyper-V users globally, representing companies and data centers of all sizes. We are the leading solutions provider for security and management applications for Hyper-V, for like migration, management, security, and monitoring. If you want to know any more information, visit five9.com or email info@five9 for more information. Again, I want to thank you for joining my session today for MVP Days. Enjoy the rest of the sessions today and have a great day.